Previously on Minardi, Christian Fittipaldi scores points, Flavio Briatore executes Order 66, and Luca Banner a prize. Coming up, Paul Stoddart buys Minardi, Paul Stoddart buys the Arrows A23, and Paul Stoddart sells Minardi. I'm Peter Brook, I'm joined by the Mobile Chicane and Ace Shield, and you're listening to the DRS Train podcast.
This is the DRS Train.
So, if you haven't worked it out already, today we're going to carry on from one of our episodes that we did several months ago, where we looked at everyone's favourite backmarket team, Minardi, in the 90s, and we're going to pick that up from 2001, when basically the team came from near collapse and was bought out by Paul Stoddart, who owned European Aviation, and so he ran the team for their last 5 seasons in Formula One. And yeah, I don't know about you two, but for me, this is probably my favourite period for Minardi, mostly because I love V10s, and also, even if the cars weren't very fast, they were at least very pretty, with some lovely black liveries.
Yeah, it's always the one I remember of. I think I came into F1 a little too late to know of the Giancarlo Minardi day. So for me, Minardi was always kind of centered around Paul Stoddart, kind of the colourful character that he was as well. Like you say, I love those kind of black liveries as well. And they always kind of had this reputation. Beginning off, you had kind of one young, very talented driver and one more moneyed, less dependable, maybe an experienced head. And then as the years went on, we got some more kind of sort of obscure names that maybe popped up for a season or two, which was always fun to see.
Paul Stoddart is the kind of team principal Steiner always thought he was and never actually managed to ever even close imitate. Paul Stoddart was truly one of a kind man. And he wasn't, he was actually competent because he always fought for his team, he always fought for good causes. I think a recurring theme in all of Minardi history is that it was a little team that always needed some help and never got it during a period in time in which Formula One did not care about the smaller teams because it had plenty. And when those started to disappear, they still didn't care enough. And Paul Stoddart was the one who advocated vocally for all the changes, for engines, cheaper engines, for same spec engines of the suppliers for the customer teams, and some limitations on many different aspects, even the budget cap. And now we have all those things to help the smaller teams, but not back when Minardi needed them. Giancarlo Minardi himself always advocated for this, but Minardi isn't very present at the microphone of the journalist. Instead, Paul Stoddart was very present. He was very political. He was very involved in the news. And so with him, Minardi really found a voice to voice the problems of Formula One.
So basically, yeah, to set the scene with what happened in this period. So the first half of the 90s had been their peak, basically. 93 and 94, they had several points finishes, including finishing as high as 4th. But then from there on, things started to decline because they scored only a single point in 95, which was in the final race. Pierluigi Martini, who had been, up until this point, their most prolific driver and scored most of their points, he was gone. They ended up not scoring any points in 97 or 98. They just scraped 1 point in 99, which could have been 4 if had Badoer's gearbox held up just a little bit longer. They were a team actually who, until this point, despite being a backmarket team, had often avoided pay drivers. But then in 2000, they basically felt they had no choice to take on Gaston Mazzacane, and they had this bright, like fluorescent yellow car. But now the original team founder Giancarlo Minardi was forced to sell the team in 2001, and so then it was picked up by Paul Stoddart, who was the owner of European Aviation. Hence the change to basically the European Minardi period. So yeah, that's kind of where things begin. It was all like very last minute, and they were. It was the car was built in haste, and they just managed to find drivers at the end. They found Tasso Marquez, who had raced them before, and a young Fernando Alonso as well.
It's worth pointing out that this, again, as always kind of happens with these histories, there's always like a little junction point where this could have gone a completely different way. We know that Stoddart ended up buying Minardi at the beginning of 2001, but throughout a lot of 2000, it looked like actually it was going to become more of a Spanish kind of flavour to the team. There were a lot of talk that their sponsors, Telefonica, they wanted to buy out the team, and they wanted to move the whole thing across to Spain as well. This was the time where we had Marc Genet was in the car, and like you said, we had Fernando Alonso coming along shortly afterwards as well. So could have had a whole kind of different sort of more Spanish flavour to it as well. On top of that as well, there was a lot of talk that they would be getting Mugen Honda engines for 2001, which kind of fell apart when Mugen decided to pull out at the end of the year. Not saying it would have been drastically better than what 2001 would eventually come out as, but just a different kind of sense of where the story could have gone.
Minardi was always extremely fixed on this point that the team should never be moved elsewhere. And so even for the 2000 negotiations, he always had this firm point that whoever would buy the team should keep the team at Faenza, not move it to other countries, which is why Paul Stoddart finally won the bid and was chosen to buy the team. And this same topic will remain in 2005 when they have to sell again, and Red Bull buys it because there were many buyers lined up, but Red Bull was the one who accepted to keep the team where it was in Faenza in Italy. And so definitely, if there was literally no other option, I think Minardi would have allowed to move the team across to Spain. And it's very interesting. Okay, no, I lost my point. Sorry. If I remember, I will intervene again. Sorry. You can move on.
So yeah, basically, 2001, new owner, everything was kind of done a bit at the last minute. I mean, they struggled even to get a tire supplier right until just before the first race. But they, initially started out quite.
It was about a 6-week turnaround from the point where Stoddart bought the team. There was very little, if any, kind of car going on there. So you had a 6-week rush job to kind of scramble together this car. I think even Fernando Alonso was kind of mucking in to try and contribute towards the engineering front. In many ways, it's kind of, you think of kind of these last minute rush jobs to scrape something together for the start of the season. You think of something like a MasterCard Lola and how terrible that kind of entry was. So the fact that Minardi were then able to turn up to the season and perform pretty admirably, certainly in comparison with like a Lola-esque performance, was quite astonishing, really.
Yes, it was also astonishing that they came up to Australia in the garages. I think they were the first one to come up. Anyway, they had one car, and the other was to be assembled because up until then it was just pieces. And so the entire team spent the time to just assemble the second car. And the first car had done one test. It was a straight line speed, literally, not turn, just turn it up and drive it straight and stop. That was the test. So yeah, it really was incredible that the car was able to finish the race. But it is also incredible how the season followed up because the engine was egregiously underpowered. I think the estimates I found on the internet ranged from 50 horsepower down to up to 100 horsepower down to everybody else. But at least in the hands of Alonso, it didn't look so bad. It looked somehow competitive. I remember, for example, in Spain, he was fighting with the Benettons. He was ahead of both Fisichella and Button at one point of the race. And then, of course, at the end of the year, there was the overtake and the race in Japan. So lots of good qualifying results across the year. So really incredible how good the season was given the circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, the car, aside from the livery, it looked basically the same as the previous year's car because they had to do it so hurriedly. And aerodynamically, it wasn't too bad. It was just the engine because they were still using a Ford Zetec R, which they'd been using those kind of engines since 1998, but this time it was rebadged as a European engine. But it meant that points. I mean, there were a couple of oddly enough, it was Marquez who actually had the best results that year. But again, this is the era of when cars used to break down a lot because he finished 9th twice, whereas Alonso's best finish was 10th in Germany. But Alonso was clearly the better of the two, and I mean there were a lot of races where people said it's like he's doing a 50-lap stint of qualifying laps. Basically, it was pretty much getting the maximum out of what was not a very competitive car.
In Germany, there was both cars stalled on the grid, and so they had to hurry back and try to fix them to get the drivers out. And I don't remember if they got both of them out. I know for sure Alonso got out again at least on the spare car because he then finished 10th. So very good job anyway by the mechanics. You really see that this team is experienced.
Mm. And at the previous race, Tasso Marquez actually failed to qualify, which was the first. Well, that was the first failure to qualify from any Minardi driver since 1996. So not a brilliant period for them.
Tasso Marquez was lucky to be there because there were many options for a driver to put in the second car, and Marquez was kind of unexpected, but the final reason they gave was that they had no better option. Marquez was bringing some money, and until someone better showed up, they would keep him. And later on, someone better showed up. The Alex Young's sponsor decided to buy him the seat, and so Marquez was respectively taken out and replaced with Alex Young, who then went on to do 2002 until he failed also to qualify 3 times in a row, so he was substituted.
Yeah, we should qualify the term better when it comes to Alex Young. Better funded for the car, maybe not better talented compared to a Marquez.
Yes.
I mean, neither of them are very good, but yeah, Young is quite a special case from the early 2000s. I think he's just lucky that Yuji Ide came along after him as well. But yeah, so 2001, they kept themselves on the grid. No points came their way, but they managed to survive. 2002 is very interesting though, because now they've got a completely new lineup because Young stays on. Alonso has become a test driver for Renault, unless it was still Benetton in 2002. No, they can Renault by that
Still
point.
Renault, yeah.
Yeah, still Renault.
There was the weird. I was reading through a sort of 2002 preview and kind of preparation for this, and there's a weird amount kind of optimism surrounding 2002 because, yeah, their main aim was getting Stoddart on board, and they kind of survived their way through 2001. And like Ace has said already, that was kind of what Minardi did a lot of the time, was just kind of survive and plug along on the 10th of a budget of what everyone else had as well. But coming into 2002, so they had a sponsor in Magnum apparently coming on board, giving they were going to contribute about £70 million across the next 4 years. It was unclear whether it was the ice cream or the condom manufacturer, but at least apparently some money was coming in. There were talks to try and get on board the Ford Cosworth deal that eventually went to Arrows. They tried to get the Ferraris that Prost had lost, and there were even chats with the Proton company in Malaysia, obviously with Alex Young being on board there to try and maybe get some sort of marketing gimmick going together there. But they ended up with a quote-unquote works engine partnership in Asia Tech, which was formerly what Peugeot were. So with that kind of on board, it was Minardi were kind of seen being in a better position than they had been in certainly previous years. The only real downside was that they'd lost Gustav Brunner had moved across to Toyota at this point, and we get Gabriel Tredozzi coming in as technical director, which I believe he was until the end of their days there. And yeah, even sort of around the seat, there was a lot of kind of hype as well. We know that Mark Webber got it eventually, but there were people like a Heinz-Harald Frentzen and Jos Verstappen on the market, and they were in discussions and could have potentially wound up there. In Verstappen's case, a year earlier than actually would happen.
Yeah, this time they just had a lot more preparation, so the car was much better designed. As you said, the Asia Tech engines, this kind of little-known French company. They'd also got Loic Biguar on the engineering side, who'd come over from Prost, who by this point had just collapsed as well. So yeah, new drivers, new look as well. I mean, the car, same black livery, but they've got a couple of new sponsors, KL, which I presume stands for Kuala Lumpur. That no doubt would have been brought on by Young. But yeah, they were just... First race was just sensational for them because the Australia 2002 is famously probably the only good race from that season. And it meant that by surviving that massive pile-up at the start and keeping out of trouble, that Webber managed to finish 5th and Young 7th, which was their best result basically in 8 years at that point.
Yeah, it's an iconic moment. I think if we sat down there and we had to list sort of the top 100 most iconic moments in F1 history, you've got to put that kind of moment in there. The fact that, yes, it was a race of kind of attrition, but the fact that Webber kept on going, he barely even fit in the car. It was so kind of mistimed in terms of how long he got there and what kind of preparation he had. To be able to come home in 5th, get those 2 huge points, kind of particularly at that point in time, what a difference that made to travel costs and budgets, etc. The image of him and Stoddart stood up on the Australia podium waving that kind of Australia flag bizarrely the only time that Webber actually would be up on that podium, and not even for finishing in the top three. It's, an incredible scene, and just that race alone does have a bearing on a lot of kind of the upcoming F1 history that we go on to see, because Webber was only ever contracted for those first three races. He wasn't bringing a great deal of budget with him. It's more kind of with the negotiations of Briatore getting him in there, and kind of Stoddart wanting to promote Australian talent as well, that he found his way into that seat. But it could have easily been just 3 races and done for Mark Webber. Instead, he goes on to secure the full year there, and then we get the years of Jaguar, Williams, and of course Red Bull, and that kind of great rivalry with Sebastian Vettel as well. So just in that one race, huge kind of rippling consequences on what would come across the next many years in Formula One.
Yeah, I mean, Webber was an interesting choice. He was the first Australian driver since David Brabham.
Brabham, I think. Oh no, David.
No,
David.
David
Brabham. Yes,
David Brabham,
yes.
1994. His career had been interesting because he kind of turned pro already, in the sense that he did the FIA GT Championship with Mercedes in '98, and that was when in Le Mans he had his famous somersault moment in the CLR. Test driver for Arrows, test driver for Benetton the year before. So he had kind of already quite a lot of pedigree. So it felt almost like a step back to be joining with a team like Minardi. But I guess if there was nowhere else to go, it's like, well, it's still Formula One at the end of the day. And clearly it paid off, because admittedly they did get very lucky to get that point. But that being said, had the point system that came in the previous year been used, they would have scored 6
points. Yeah.
6 or 7 points. And using the modern point system, it would have been about 25, 30 points. Which again, then for them is a lot. So his results for most of the year were actually very good. Whereas Young, he had 3 failures to qualify. Whereas Marquez's one was the year before was a dodgy throttle. Whereas Young's were basically all just because of him. And so they rested him for 2 races, and they brought in Anthony Davidson, who was a sort of Mr. Supersub at the time, and then brought him back, and it didn't seem to improve things at all.
How many scores would Toyota and Arrows have scored with the 10 first to 8th and the modern point system?
Arrows with the modern point system would have scored 17 points. Toyota would have scored 8, 14, 22, 26, 28, 30, 34, 36, 38, 40 points. Minardi would have got 10, 16, 20, 21, 22. So they would have still beaten Arrows, but then Arrows didn't do the full season. But they would have been beaten by Toyota. Certainly.
Then it's better the way it happened, because those modi was really crucial for Minardi.
Wasn't it the case actually? Wasn't it the case actually in Australia though that it was Olivier Parnis, it would have been, because this is Toyota's first ever race. I think he spun and got passed by Mark, and he finished 6th. And that basically sealed.
Sarlo, and Sarlo was chasing down Webber, but spun, and that kind of confirmed.
Yes,
I mean, Minardi still would have been in the points, but it confirmed 5th rather than 6th.
Because they got 2 points themselves, because it was 2-6, so instead of 1/5, so they lost to them on countback.
Yes, Webber had a differential problem, so he was getting caught up by Mika Salo very quickly, and then he got this illumination, because he remembered that in one spot in turn 3 in Australia, there was, I think, low grip, there was an oil something on the track, and so he positioned the car in such a way Salo would drive over the spot and would spin out, and it worked exactly as he planned, and so he had an easy 5th place, and he really enjoyed the in lap after the end of the race. That was just the Australians were cheering more for him than for Michael. It was an incredible day.
I mean, I think, to be honest, he would have been the first Australian to score points at the Australian Grand Prix ever, actually, because it came in '85. Alan Jones was at Haas Lola, and he wouldn't have got points in '85 or '86. Gary Brabham definitely did.
And then it's just a pair of Brabhams after that, which one was in the Simtech. So
first ever Aussie points at the Australian Grand Prix, and the first Australian to score points, since Alan Jones, like nearly 20 years earlier. It's hardly surprising it was a big moment. There was a low point, however, of course, because they had Spain was interesting because they voluntarily withdrew both cars because they'd suffered a bunch of front and rear wing failures all weekend. They're like, we're just not going to do this race. And based on their qualifying times, they probably thought, well, there's no point because Webber's 8/10 off the next car, and then Young's another 1.5 seconds off of him. So yeah, let's not.
Paul Stoddart came up many times, and he repeated always the same thing. The perfect lineup I could ever wish for my team was Alonso and Webber. And I find it very funny because Alonso and Webber then became very good friends with one another. And in fact, you see that when Webber picked Alonso up after he retired in Nürburgring 2011, and then they switch roles for Singapore 2013. And so you really see they were really friends. Mark Webber in his book, in his autobiography, I think, oftentimes spoke about Alonso and how good friends they were, and now so often they got close to becoming teammates and never actually did.
And besides, I mean, even though things this season had gone better and they'd got points and everything, money was still a problem. So there'd been, first of all, Stoddart had tried unsuccessfully to challenge the French courts, which had allowed Tom Walkinshaw of Arrows to buy the Prost entry, which was that failed attempt to get Phoenix Finance off the go. And then near the end, the European aviation itself was also struggling, and he was considering selling that. And then he had to change, even though Young was a pay driver, he wasn't really paying them much. And so he was trying to chase Young for something like $200,000 in unpaid fees to the team. So there was still, the struggles just did not stop, basically. And then come 2003, they had another entirely new lineup. Webber went over to Jaguar. Young was just gone because no one wanted him. So they brought in Justin Wilson and Jos Verstappen, the everyman who just drove for everybody. This car again, new look, new sponsors. They brought in, was it HP Invent or Trust? So that new big sponsors, Superfund as well. They almost had no tires before the beginning of the season. They tried to get Avon tires, I think, and then eventually they got Bridgestones. But they had, it was just on the rocks once again.
If I remember correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, the 2003 Minardi was basically, they picked up the 2002 Auros project and just worked on them somehow to try and make the 2003 car. And so, because Paul Stoddart had said that they finally got the bid to take some stuff of Auros, and they saw it was much better than what they had. And I find this very funny because previously, when Prost GP folded, there was a bid war between Minardi and Arrows won it, to the dismay of Paul Stoddart. And just how curious it is how things go around, that he lost that bid and that the team that won bankrupted, so he actually took over that team. And 2003 so begins with Jordan being unexpectedly very bad. They became a backmarker. And it also began with the Brazil race, third race of the year. Yes, third race. And it was an incredible race because so many crashes, so many safety cars made it so there was a very damn easy strategy. That is, you just put as much fuel as you can on your drivers and never pit them. And so this strategy can only work if there are continuous safety cars. And as backmarkers, both Jordan and Minardi did exactly this with their drivers. And it literally turned out incredibly good, also by the red flag, because even though they had fueled them, their drivers fully, they still wouldn't have gotten to the end of the race. But since there was a red flag, the race would have ended sooner. And according to Paul Stoddart himself, they had fueled Jos Verstappen for just enough to get to the lap count in which the red flag was exposed. So actually, if Jos Verstappen hadn't spun during the race, we would have been talking about a Minardi podium, maybe even a Minardi win. Instead, we saw Fisichella winning the race on a backmarker Jordan. And this is the first time that Minardi gets beaten by Jordan in the Constructors, to the dismay of Paul Stoddart, that in 2005 was incredibly angry about Indianapolis and this ruining the fight with Jordan.
The other famous anecdote for 2003 is the pole position that was not to be. for Verstappen in Manicourt, because that was when we had to do this. It was done in 2 separate sessions on Friday and Saturday, and they based it on reverse order of the previous session. So he went out by going out first. He got the best lap in before the rain came in, but then the following day it didn't rain, and so he lost that pole position. But it was looking good for them until the following day. And I think for that reason, that was one of the reasons they got rid of that and then replaced it with that stupid aggregate thing, and then eventually the system we currently have. Because we almost ended up with a Minardi pole position just because they got to go out like after the rain. I think after it stopped.
And also in 2003 in Hungary, Minardi could celebrate their 300 Grand Prix racing.
So it was a lot of interesting milestones. It is interesting though that even with the expansion of the point system, they still failed to score any points. So no top 8 finishes. And again, like I said, they really were on the rocks because they'd wanted both Verstappen and Wilson paid something like £2 million each to race for them. They wanted Ferrari engines because Asia Tech went bust, but they were asking for about 15 million, which is too much. So they went for Cosworths. Again, the issue, they were taking Avon tyres, and then they got that deal with Bridgestone because until this they've been using Michelin. So all just very rocky, and it meant it was disappointing because they didn't get any points. Also, Justin Wilson mid-season, he went over to Jaguar, and then they brought in Nicholas Kaser, who one of these sort of oddities from the past, in that he did 5 races fairly unassumingly, and that was that really. Never came anywhere near any other teams.
Yeah, I don't think there was any driver aside from Alonso and Webber who ever got anywhere far after going to Minardi during the Paul Stoddart period. Because, well, Marquez, obviously nobody picked it up. Jung, you already said that nobody wanted him. And Davidson was, he got super auguri. And then one day he could have gotten a podium. He has a problem on the car, so it's all about Sato. And then we have Wilson, who went to Jaguar. I don't remember if he did. He didn't do another year somewhere else.
No, he had issues. Basically, his height was a big problem. He had to do like fundraising and crowdfunding to try and get the Minardi seat as well, because he tried to get one with Arrows the year before, but they were like, "Well, you're too tall. That's not going to work." And then Minardi, he managed to convince them when he got the funds in with a lot of help. I think he put himself on the stock market so people could invest in him. It was a very unique take on it to get that seat. But it meant that even though he got the promotion to Jag mid-season, that was it. He didn't stay in Formula 1. He went to IndyCar after that.
Yeah. I think there was a fair amount of expectation on Wilson that year because, like we've said, you had Alonso coming in there who was kind of this big, exciting talent. And you can kind of go, okay, that's kind of flash of the pan. That is what it is. But then you have Webber coming in the next year. And again, really exciting. Both these kind of guys, if you read back through kind of the early 2000s, championed as these contenders to kind of take Schumacher's crown as and when kind of Schumacher retires or stumbles. So now Minardi have kind of got this reputation, Stoddart in particular, of kind of highlighting, right, we can get this really kind of talented young driver to begin their journey with us, move them on elsewhere. So, and there was a fair bit of hype around Wilson. They originally wanted to get him in for 2002 in place of Young, but again, because of those aforementioned height issues, he couldn't fit in the car, so they got Davidson instead. So yeah, then coming into Minardi for 2003 with a bit more preparation time, he was showing himself really well in that year. And I think unfortunately for him, saw an opportunity to move up the grid to Jaguar. And, you know, as anyone knows, kind of Jaguar may look an attractive proposition on paper as kind of this Ford Works outfit, but really was kind of a career killer for a lot of people, and particularly in that 2003 car as well. You know, Pitsonia, who again had been another very kind of championed, hyped up talent, had really struggled in that second car. Wilson came in and was also kind of struggling there as well. There was a lot of kind of agreement that it was an operation that was kind of more focusing on the one car, on Webber's car, than it was on the second car, kind of focusing on the points that Webber could get and leaving the second one more as kind of an afterthought in a way. It was, you know, a tricky kind of car to be driving as well. It was one that was really good at kind of getting its heat into its tyres, which Webber was able to showcase with those kind of brilliant qualifying laps we saw, but then you would see in the races it would kind of fall back because it would wear through those tyres so quickly. That was a lot for kind of poor Justin Wilson to then have to jump in and have 5 races or whatever it was to kind of prove himself. So yeah, a shame he didn't kind of get to go out that full season with Minardi, maybe kind of blooded himself a bit better and then been given an opportunity somewhere else. We never really got to see enough of him in Formula One.
Then the other drivers were Chiesa, who didn't get far. We have Verstappen, who I think ended his career there in Minardi that year. In 2004, we have Bruni and Baumgartner, which both of them did not get another year in Formula One. And then for the final year, we have Christian Albers, who I think went to. It wasn't called Jordan anymore, it was called Midland in 2006. Okay? And then Friesacker and Durnbos. And both of them, I don't think, unless you are really a passionate fan about this Formula One period, I don't think you ever even heard of them. So really, it was only Alonso and Webber who ever got some more big in Formula One during the Paul Stoddart period, which is completely opposite of what happened to Minardi previously during the 90s. And it didn't change anything, though, because so in the 90s, but even prior, since the very beginning, Minardi was very focused on young talent. I already spoke about it in the last episode. And anyway, when Paul Stoddart took over, Minardi pressed this point about developing young talents. And so he kept doing the end of the year test for the most impressive young drivers. And then he kept up the technology research for the team and the engineer development programs, hiring new engineers and then teach them the job. It was continuous, and it's kind of weird how in the post-order period they keep doing this, and it produces no talent, basically.
It was just kind of
Because-
clinging to life, really, in terms of the drivers they could get. There wasn't much of a vision in terms of the kind of person we want or whatever, because they got young talent, but then they'd also been able to get people like Michele Alboreto in, seasoned veterans happy to see out the end of their career there and that. Whereas this time it was all about, okay, who can pay us the most, and you'll have to do. But you mentioned about Arrows before, so that comes into play in 2004. So after Arrows collapsed, yes, Paul Stoddart, he bought all of the A23 chassis. They tested them in 2003 against the PS03. They found it was better. And they thought, okay, well, going forward, we're going to use this. But then they thought, he thought, I don't really want to just use another team's car completely. So instead, what they did was they built their own car, and then they took elements of the Arrows and put it into the design process of that. Hence, we have the PS04B and not just the PS04, which does exist, but I think there's one on static display on some cruise ship somewhere or whatever. Only a test car. So they had that, but then even with implementing this data from this car, it was a 2-year-old design already, and they had these new drivers, and so it wasn't really any better, to be honest. I mean, Baumgartner got a point in Indianapolis, but again, that was a race of a lot of finishes. But other than that, they were never contenders, ever.
Yeah, I think, like Ace said, Minardi had previously had this reputation of kind of generating these young talents and bringing them into the fold. And now we had drivers who were young, yes, talented, a little less so. Gianmaria Bruni had been their test driver the previous year, but his promotion was more kind of at the behest of some Italian investors than it was any kind of sense that he was going to be another Alonso or Webber. Baumgartner, we know, is the greatest Formula One driver of all time, so maybe that's kind of a slight cut away from the mold. But in all seriousness, he was steady, he was dependable. Famously, kind of what was it, in Brazil in 2004, he set a time that would have been good enough for pole at the previous year's race, but then obviously then cascades down to the back, bearing in mind differences in conditions and cars and stuff like that as well. Yeah, it was a slow and steady, but there was kind of this maybe growing sense around Minardi at the time of not knowing what their plan was or what they were kind of going to do, because now it was just kind of a case of surviving year after year after year, and Startup was kind of battling against all these other kind of forces. You think particularly 2004, around 8 of the 10 teams on the grid had some sort of manufacturer backing or link in some way. To run through, you've got Ferrari, Williams, BMW, McLaren, Mercedes, Renault, BAR, Honda, you've got the Jaguar, Ford, you've got Toyota. Sauber, whilst a customer outfit, had very kind of close links to Ferrari and were alleged at times to be using old Ferrari cars and old Ferrari parts at a time when that was still kind of a bit less accepted in the sport. So you really just had Jordan and Minardi left, who were these independent customer outfits. Jordan had very quickly slumped to the back of the field and were now in the point where actually Jordan was getting a bit disinterested and looking to move the team on. So it was just Stoddart who was kind of fighting that corner for those smaller teams. It was either in, I think, 2003 or 2004, they were campaigning to change that qualifying system to bring it back to the old 1 hour formats and bring it back in the 107% rule again. And I believe in order to do that, they had to get every single party voting on board for that because it was a mid-season change and Stoddart was vehemently against it. I think probably knowing with what he had and the cars he had, that would mean a lot of DNQs would be coming his way, and that means a lot of sponsorship, airtime and things like that as well. So yeah, it was increasingly becoming like a one-man fight for Stoddart in this point in time against, if we look at the 2000s, it's kind of this point where manufacturers are starting to come into the sport, and you can highlight like a Jordan at that point in time where they'd fought for the championship in 99, but now when BMW and Ford and that were coming in, it was harder and harder for an independent team to make their own way, and especially for a Minardi with a teeny tiny little budget, they were increasingly having no chance of not even thinking about moving forward, just surviving from year to year.
Yeah, the sponsors went through a change because they had a company called Hilux had been their title sponsor in 2004, but then they withdrew midway through the season. So they went just from Hilux Minardi to just Minardi. Again, it changed.
Sorry, just to jump in quickly. Yes, that was unfortunately a little bit of sentimentality on the part of Stoddart that unfortunately proved to be a bit of a disaster. So just before the British Grand Prix that year, they had their team manager, John Walton, sadly passed from a heart attack. And so in tribute to that, they ran all black livery, no sponsors on it. And I think it said, John Boy and all kinds of tributes to him on there. But they didn't actually consult Hilux about that. They just turned up at the Grand Prix with no sponsors and with these tributes to John Walton, which was a nice touch. Hilux were understandably not hugely impressed by it, and that's why that sponsorship ended up getting pulled in the end, because there'd been this huge miscommunication between the two, and then suddenly, this whole load of sponsorship money just goes down the drain, unfortunately.
He does really feel like the kind of Gunther Steiner of the early 2000s, but a lot more likable, I guess, and also it feels more competent in many ways. I mean, Gunther Steiner was actually around at the time, interestingly enough, working for Jag. Maybe that's part of the reason that they struggled so much. I don't know.
Gunther Steiner was the team principal of a small team who could take everything it ever wished to from Ferrari, that it was purposely brought in to keep up the number of 10 teams on the grid, which could find as many sponsors as he wanted, and decided to find Rich Energy, who scammed them out. And you compare him to a Paul Stoddart, who had everything against him, who, despite having everything against him, still managed to find a sponsorship to keep the team at Faenza, as he and Giancarlo Minardi wanted, and a personality who could be liked and was liked, and a personality who always encouraged young talent. Steiner is nowhere near close anything like that. Steiner did not encourage young talents, never.
But yeah, so they then went into 2005. So changes once again, 2 new drivers, a car that looked very different, both in terms of design and livery. They got rid of the old sponsors, so they had Lost Boys and Ozjet, I think it was, which I guess is the replacement for European Aviation. This car stood out apparently because it was the first car to have double slits in the. They had those side-mounted winglets at the time on the side pods. It was the first car to put 2 kind of planes in those, and also had a slit in the rear wing, a vertical one, which no one else had done before. So a couple of small innovations on the design front. Not that it made much difference, because once again they were the slowest team, but this time because Jordan were in such a decline, and by this point Jordan had been sold by Eddie Jordan and were owned by Alex Schneider in the Midland Group, they had someone to at least vaguely be competitive with until you get to Indianapolis, and then that comes to an end.
Yeah, Indianapolis, of course, which Paul Stoddart famously did not want to be a part of at all. He was he was already very vocal against the likes of Mosley and Eccleston, but that kind of really escalated that kind of tensions between the two of them. Stoddart, was a racer's racer, and he wanted everyone to go racing. He didn't want that kind of disastrous 6-car race that we had, so he tried to negotiate getting some tyres or putting that chicane in. Or he was very heavily involved with kind of trying to make sure that race went ahead properly. Didn't want to be part of that race anyway, but unfortunately was kind of strong-armed into it because Jordan were going to be part of it, and that's who Minardi were competing against. If they had not taken part and it had just been Jordan, they would have scored whatever it was, the 11 points they had, and that was a gulf that they were never going to be able to pass throughout the season. So they were forced to take part of it, and then even by the end of it as well, what was it, 11 to, I'm doing the maths in my head, 7 points or something, like even a 4-point gulf was still far too much for Minardi at that point in time to be able to surpass. So they had to roll the dice and hope that maybe they were the ones who got in the position that Tiago Montero got into and didn't, unfortunately.
I mean, it was interesting. I mean, that race is, maybe not the race itself, but that race weekend is interesting for lots of reasons. One of the things I've always found interesting is that because in the race coverage, because they still had to present it as if it was an ordinary race, most of the coverage is on Jordan and Minardi. And particularly in those opening laps when it's that because the Ferraris disappear into the distance and it's those four sticking together, and you think to yourself, that's probably the most coverage they've got in a race more in the past 10 years combined, to be honest. But as you said, even though Albers had outqualified Narain Carter-Kane at Jordan, he got ahead of him in the pit stops anyway, so they finished in formation and also quite far apart. And there wasn't anything you could really, even though they scored points, it made no difference because it didn't affect their position in the constructors and meant they could have got more money from it. But yeah, the two drivers they've had, so entirely, as we said before, Christian Albers, Patrick Friesacher. Albers had a reasonable background in terms of his racing. Friesacher was a Red Bull Junior at one point, and then his money ran out. He had this weird thing. He was being sponsored by some businessman who was trying to get Austrian citizenship in some dodgy way, and there was a big scandal involving that basically meant he lost all of his money, and so they got rid of him, and they brought in Robert Dornbos, who was never a Red Bull Junior, but then he did drive for Red Bull in 2006, and kind of stuck around with them in the background for a couple of years as well.
Yeah, and the lineup Albers Dornbos was the first fully Dutch lineup since the last time, which was the Dutch Grand Prix of 1962. And I don't remember, when was the first race where all the car finished? I remember it was a...
Well, that year, Monza, that year, everyone finished. There was a race in the 60s, I think, that everyone finished as well.
I remember it was a Dutch Grand Prix.
Ah.
Yeah.
Because, Dornbos... Dornbos is a weird one because he is Dutch, but then he also raced with a Monegasque license. But I think because he just lived in Monaco, but then it was like, well, every driver lives in Monaco, so they can all claim that if they want to. It's like you're not Monegasque, or not in the way that Charles Leclerc is, or something. So it lists him as Monegasque. It's like, but you're basically Dutch. So that, I guess that would have been the first, because Dutch drivers have been few and far between, and not particularly successful until quite recently. So that's I hadn't actually considered that one. Yeah.
Okay, I checked. The first race where everybody finished was the Dutch Grand Prix of 1961. So we just missed out on the coincidence there.
Yeah. So this car, they brought this one, the PS05, they actually brought it in at the 4th round, which at the time a few teams did. Ferrari used to do that. They delay it by a couple of times, but usually because they were probably spending ages finessing the car and making sure it was perfect, whereas Minardi was like, well, because we just haven't built it in time, so we have to just make do with the previous one and then we can bring this one in. And then I don't know, need to look at when it was exactly that then the decision came to sell the team completely, and it was picked up by Red Bull because they're like, oh, this could make a nice B team. So maybe
I believe it was around the Belgian Grand Prix, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah.
Maybe wrong.
So that would it was so Red Bull were the ones that stepped forwards, and they also actually absorbed all of Minardi's assets and resources into the Red Bull Driver Search, which was a program that they had. It's actually very hard to find information on this, but they had it from 2002 to about 2005, and it was designed to find American talent in Formula One. The only winners I know, because the first time it happened, it was a bit of a farce and it was really, really disorganized. And the four winners, the three or four winners, the only one that survived more than a year as a Red Bull Junior after that was Scott Speed, who did eventually go to Formula One. John Edwards also won it, but he never made it to Formula One. So they obviously involved Minardi in that. But yeah, so when they got bought out and they became Scuderia Toro Rosso, this this was very controversial because a lot of people want to know it's the same factory and why can't you just keep it as Minardi? Because they've been around. Well, they've been around for 20 years at this point, and they've had over 350 races or something. It might have been 350 exactly because I think it was the Chinese Grand Prix that they were commemorating that milestone, and they got a bunch of their former drivers to kind of pose for a photo. So Alonso turned up, and Webber and Trulli and Fisichella and everyone else because they were all still racing as sort of examples of their best products that people that started with Minardi managed to be relatively successful afterwards.
At the 2003 Grand Prix, I forgot to mention this, at the Monza Grand Prix of 2003, the grid was made up of 40% by current or ex-Minardi drivers. And this is basically the same we are getting next year for Red Bull Juniors, I think. Okay, actually, I have to check.
I think it is 40% of 2025's grid are Red Bull Juniors. It's two entirely different companies, even if they share a factory. But yeah, both very, very prolific and a similar sort of vision. But Minardi, yeah, they are that. It's a team from a bygone age. It's not. We see so much less of that now that those kind of privateer teams that kind of struggle and don't really exist outside of the Formula One element, because now we have Red Bull, which is this whole massive multimedia franchise, and all the big manufacturer teams and everyone else. And then there aren't many teams left that are in a position similar to Minardi, or they are people like Williams, but then Williams are constantly struggling and seem to be way behind the times.
Yeah, it's in a way you couldn't really have a Minardi now, and there are mixed feelings about when you've got Toro Rosso taking over, because in one sense there is part of that Minardi spirit they're keeping alive of wanting to promote young talents and give people that kind of first opportunity and allow them to kind of move forward and express themselves and show what they can do, unless they're bringing back Daniel Ricciardo again. The other sense is that, now it's a lot more of kind of a moneyed and ruthless kind of operation, or certainly it used to be as well. Yes, young drivers were coming in, but they could have been discarded and put on the scrap heap very quickly, which does seem to kind of go against that mentality that Minardi had. I know there was a big campaign when they announced that Toro Rosso were going to be, Red Bull were going to be taking over, to try and keep that Minardi name and keep some of the spirit alive, which was unsuccessful in the end. It's strange. I think there's plenty of instances in the past where an outfit gets taken over by a new entity, and you don't mind so much because it's moving on to kind of bigger and better things, and so it doesn't necessarily need kind of a nod to the past. But it is a little bit of a shame in a way that there's not that kind of thing around V-Carb, Toro Rosso, Minardi, whatever you want to call it these days. That there's not some sort of little like tribute to Minardi there, because it was such a positive kind of racers foundation that it was built upon.
In my opinion, it is a huge shame that the Minardi name disappeared, but it was the right thing to do, because 2006 Toro Rosso and Toro Rosso up to 2009, but more precisely up to basically nowadays, so 2021, I think. Anyway, that Toro Rosso was completely different from Minardi. So Minardi was a team that scouted talent basically out in the open. It did not have a junior academy. It did not have anything fancy like that. You just give the chance to a young driver. If he does well, you sign a contract with him. The Minardi did everything in-house. The technology, they had the research and development for the technologies they researched themselves. And Toro Rosso instead just took everything it could from Red Bull, and that was it. And so if Toro Rosso had just taken the name Minardi, it would have been cool in name only, because in practice it would have been completely different from the actual Minardi team. Minardi team is everything you could ever hope from a small team. Someone who just faced bankruptcy over and over again, always in the near brink of doom, and always came out somehow through sheer odds. And Toro Rosso instead had a huge backing and did nothing by themselves. They literally were a racing team that took a car, assembled it, and went to the racetracks. Completely different things. So I think it was the right thing to do. And also, this allowed the Paul Stoddart and the remaining mechanics in 2006, after the Formula One adventure was over, to go overseas and try 1 year at another category. I don't remember which.
Camp car.
Okay, yeah.
Minardi
Okay,
Team
Champ
US.
Car.
Minardi Team USA.
And so the Minardi team actually had one last year in 2006 in another category. Their car, it's called the model Lola B02/50, is actually featured in their page about the cars and drivers of Minardi's history. So maybe no Formula One fan actually cares about that year, but we must remember that's still Minardi team, pure Minardi team.
It's worth considering. There's a very kind of tasty little what if in this scenario where, for whatever reason, let's say Minardi hadn't been sold on and carried on into 2006, you would have a Minardi powered by those kind of rev limited V10 Ford Cosworths that Stoddart had negotiated and Toro Rosso ended up using, but also driving in the car we could have had Valentino Rossi, a V10 limited Minardi. The sources say that obviously there was a lot of talk about whether Rossi would move from MotoGP to Formula One at the time. There were discussions with Ferrari, and obviously Luca de Montezemolo was putting in a kind of big bid to get third cars back in to do that. In kind of more recent history, it's kind of more fed up that actually there was no chance of him going directly into Ferrari, but he would have gone to a more Italian or Ferrari aligned kind of outfit, bedded in there, and then potentially moved across. So Sauber was one mooted option, but so was Minardi as well. I'm not going to say that it would have been anything particularly spectacular or, an Alonso Weber-esque kind of season in that Minardi. But given that, the Toro Rossos, yes, with the benefit of kind of some Red Bull engineering, were a little close to the midfield and occasionally in Q2 that year. It would have been interesting, could have also been an absolute disaster, but either way, it would have been very exciting to watch.
You're right. That could have happened because you just made me remember something I found outrageous, and it's about Ferrari. Because there's a reason why Minardi always struggled throughout the years. And the main reason is that Ferrari didn't care about Minardi. In the sense, at any point in his career, Jean Todt could have just went up to Minardi and told him, okay, I'm gonna buy the team, I'm gonna turn it into a junior team of Ferrari, and Minardi would have gladly accepted it. That option was always on the table, not only during the Paul Stoddart period, also in the late 90s. And Jean Todt just never did. He just used Minardi as it was, just took the engineers after they had been trained and got some experience from Minardi by giving them a better contract. If he had to put some drivers in the Minardi team to give them some experience, he did. If he didn't like those drivers, basically, Jean Todt considered Minardi as already the junior team of Ferrari, but never really put it on paper, never put the money on it. He just took it for granted. And so we now miss the chance of seeing a Ferrari and a junior team of Ferrari. And I think across the years it would have been far better than Red Bull having a junior team in Toro Rosso. And so I think that was criminal. And you're right, if 2006 Minardi was still present, if Red Bull hadn't bought the team, it may have very well happened that Ferrari just took Valentino Rossi and put it on the Minardi, because that was how Ferrari treated the team. And now they pay the consequences, because Ferrari would have benefited a huge amount from having a junior team.
I mean, I suppose even though it's Valentino Rossi, it would have been a risky choice putting a motorbike, somebody who drives motorbikes into Formula One cars. But then I guess it's fairly harmless having him start out at a team like Minardi rather than one of the big teams, which probably wouldn't have worked out so well. But this would be a less pressurizing environment. I mean, these days, even with the current, RBV car Racing Bull, whatever they're called now, some people still like to refer to them as Minardi. I mean, for me, I kind of feel like the moment's gone because maybe because I wasn't really watching Formula One when Minardi were around. There's very little of that element left, other than they have the same factory, and there's probably a few engineers or mechanics that were there in 2005 and earlier. I'm more inclined to I prefer to just call them Toro Rosso because they serve that role as a Red Bull B team. But I think Minardi itself is kind of dead now.
Yeah, the current team is kind of different from back then, because now it is more, how can I say this, multinational, in the sense, last year no, not last year, this February, because today is the 30th of December, so it's still this year. So this year in February, actually, someone from the team is the race sporting director. What's the name? Oh, I forgot his name. Anyway, I think it's a sporting director of VCARB. Came up to do a speech in my university, and so he was there, and he explained how the team currently works. And it works that there is the base at Faenza, which is the main base of the team. Then there is another base in England where the wind tunnel of Red Bull is, and so basically that communicates with the Red Bull team. And then they are trying to make a work from home structure, in the sense that there is a third base which isn't located anywhere. It's all the people who don't work either at Faenza or in their base in England, but still contribute to the team. And so it might be people working from home, but it's also the team on track, and it's also some small bases of a few people somewhere in the world. And anyway, they are trying right now, VCARB, to create a structure so that all these people, even though they aren't in the same place, they can easily communicate and contribute to the team as well as they would be doing if they were at the same base. And this is a completely opposite approach to what the current top teams are doing. And I think it's clear the objective is that Red Bull doesn't like putting everything in the same structure, and it has a second team to experiment, so they are experimenting with that team. And so if it works, it could be incredible. If they make work from home work, it's actually going to be incredible, although I think it's going to take a dozen of years.
Yeah, it seems that it was a considerably smaller outfit at the time, and again, more sort of insular, because it was an all-Italian team in the sense that most of the staff were Italian, even though their last Italian driver was in 1997, so they managed to go, I'm pretty certain, I can't think of any others, or Badua, 1999 was their last.
Bruni, 2004.
Bruni, yeah.
Yeah.
Bruni.
Yeah, Bruni was
Easy to forget Bruni, but he was there. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we didn't score any points. It's just, yeah. I mean, he was a funny one because he did that, and then he actually went to GP2 after doing a year of Formula One and did 2 years of that. Which, I mean, GP2 was an entirely new series, but again, you don't. There's only a few examples of drivers who have actually done that and gone back down again. And he got, well, in 2006 certainly he didn't do. He got a couple of wins, but was extremely convincingly beaten by the likes of Lewis Hamilton, who won the title. Which I guess shows quite the goals. But then he did well because he did European Le Mans. He won several championships in that, and they had their test driver in 2004, Baz Linders. He was their third driver at every race that year. He won he had a very good junior career, and he won 3 or 4 FIA GT titles after, but he never got a word in for getting a seat with anyone in Formula One. I think I was going to say Dutch, but actually Belgian. That's another Dutch driver, but no, I think he was Belgian.
Kind of funny, because you make it seem like Bruni just found the wrong teammates. And so in Formula One he had Baumgartner, which is obviously the greatest talent ever, but nobody will ever admit it. Then he found Hamilton in GP2, and then he went to another category and he did well. And it reminds me of Johnny Cecotto when he tried to switch from 2 wheels to 4 wheels. And so he found a teammate, Michele Alboreto, which has a rookie beat in Formula 2. And so, not happy about the fact that he was beaten, he accused the team of favoring the Italian driver. He went to another team, Tolman, and then there he was teammate of Ayrton Senna. So the situation really improved for him.
Interesting anecdote about Senna, actually. He had made a promise to Giancarlo Minardi that he would drive for them in the late 90s. This had gone back, even though I don't think he never raced for the Minardi junior team, but he had a very close relationship with Giancarlo Minardi. I think his decision was that once he'd won his 5th title, obviously he wanted to match Fangio, I presume, or just beat Prost on that front, one of the two. He would then spend a year at Minardi to, quote, make them great. So this would have been around 96, 97, and then maybe retired with them. And this is one of the lesser known ones, because I think a lot of assumptions are that if Senna was still alive, he basically would have probably just kept going with Williams because they were the best team, and then probably retired maybe at the end of 97 when they bring in the groove tyres and the narrow track and all of that. But yeah, that could we were denied that opportunity to see Senna driving a Minardi.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think we might have
it's
brought that up in the last time. But yeah, there was, I think it
Mm.
was, the plan was Williams for 2 or 3 years. I think there was talk that there would have been at least a year or two at Ferrari as well, more for just like a bucket list thing than anything. And then, yeah, to close that out in Minardi, I think what would have been 98 or 99 or so. So, yeah, Senna passed the peak of his powers, but still would have been exciting to see, yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, it's really weird, Minardi, across its entire history, just how many missed occasion it had, missed good occasion and also missed the bankruptcy occasion. So it really just things turned out that it stayed on the brink of collapse, but never actually dying. So you have at the beginning, when they debuted in Formula One, it was forced, otherwise they had to close the team. Maybe we will cover it another time more in depth. Then, before they scored their first point, they were also on the brink of collapse because he had to fight Campos, and he had a big Spanish sponsor. So, of course, the sponsor wasn't happy. And so the fact that Martini got in and scored the first point of the team actually saved the team because the sponsor then did not leave. And then you go to 1991, they finally get the Ferrari deal, and the car isn't good because the gearbox isn't suited to the engine, and they don't have the money to pay the engines, so they have to switch to worse engines. And so that moment is gone also. Then they got close to a Mugen on the deal, and they just never fell through. Then Briatore almost collapsed the team, then it didn't. Then they were kind of trying to recover from the huge debt they had incurred when one of the co-owners, Mancini, I don't remember the name anymore, but anyway, he got cancer, and so he had to leave the team, and so they were again on the brink of collapse till they just barely found sponsors. And then during the entire Paul Stoddart period, this entire period is a period where there are infinitely amount of small teams that either die immediately or make it big. Like look at Sauber, he began in 1994 and then got good breaks. He got Ferrari helps, and then he got the BMW work deal, and then it survived, it got some success. Minardi is literally the only team that never got a big deal, but still somehow survived the entire period. Even Jordan was
Mm.
competitive at the beginning. They had some financial backing. Minardi never had that. It's incredible. It's unique, the team.
I mean, they had that period in the early 90s when they were basically in the midfield, but I think they were being flattered somewhat by this was that period, late 80s, early 90s, there were a ton of tiny teams that shouldn't have been in Formula One in there. And so that basically flattered them because it meant there were a lot of other people that were much slower. But then by 95, 96, all of those teams had gone and they had nothing to hide behind anymore. And so they were just kind of, surrendered, resigned to being the slowest team from then on. But it's just that even though compared to those teams, yes, they did have the same financial struggles and everything else, and the cars weren't that competitive, but they always showed up and they finished most races and they could more or less keep up. They weren't just oppressively bad or anything like that. I mean, I like a lot of their cars. I find because now they still do. I think it's annually they do the Minardi Day, which I think is done at Imola, and they get all the classic ones out. You don't often see the Paul Stoddart era ones, which are my favourite ones to show, but you'll see the ones mid '90s and the early ones that had like the Lamborghini V12 in it as well, and all of those. So they're quite popular cars to see at track days, which is nice because they're quite cheap to run, I imagine.
Yeah, there's this huge kind of branching history, like we've said, where there's so many opportunities where things could have been slightly differently, or maybe one of those kind of major manufacturers or supports could have come on board, and that would have changed the whole thing. I guess it's kind of nice in a way that it never happened because it kind of kept Minardi as pure as it always was. It was always about going racing and enjoying the racing and that young talent as well. So to circle way back to the beginning of the episode, I think there's one really interesting branch that we didn't cover, which is that there's a potential that we could not only not discussing any of this, we could be talking an entirely different kind of F1 history. So if we circle back to Mr. Stoddart, Minardi was not the first kind of F1 venture he'd wanted to be involved with. He had been around F1 sales since around 96, 97. He was involved with Tyrrell for a good period of time. He sponsored, I think it was 97 and 98. There's a European sponsor or some sort of Stoddart sponsor on the car. And in that time, Stoddart did try and purchase Tyrrell. I think they had agreed a £25 million sale or something like that before shortly, not long after that, British American Tobacco comes along and says, we've got a lot more money. Would you like that instead? And Tyrrell reluctantly says, yes, please. If there's a future, a reality where Stoddart has bought Tyrrell, then does that mean we don't get BAR, we don't get Honda, we don't get Braun, we don't get Mercedes? We are kind of living in a hugely kind of different stratosphere and timeline of where all that happens. And a little subset of that is that Minardi may not have survived beyond the end of 2001. It could have been bought by any other kind of number of conglomerates or something different entirely. So just something to consider, the effect that Paul Stoddart has, the reality that we're living in now, not just on kind of the effect of how vehemently he supported kind of the smaller teams and fighting back against the bigger manufacturers to make sure that he was getting a fair share and could survive as well.
Yeah, they were kind of, they did stand out in that there was a lot of respect for them, even though they were, small budget, small team, not competitive, but people, knew them as survivors, and they kind of listened to them. And maybe because of the way the voting worked, like we said about him vetoing the change on qualifying, that they definitely have influence. And he was someone, Stoddart in particular, did like to sort of punch above his weight, I guess. Whereas these days, I feel like if you have one of the back, like Williams or Hassel, one of the ones at the back, Sauber, complaining all the time, people would just kind of ignore it a bit more.
He knew how to play the game. He could see that Formula One was a game to be played. I think famously there was a time when, like I said, there was all those manufacturers coming in. He was campaigning for these manufacturers to sell, if they were selling engines to independent teams, to do it at a lot more of kind of a cut price deal. But in return, they would support those teams in all kinds of voting procedures, and if there were regulations being introduced and that team didn't like them, then Minardi would support them, or Jordan would support them, or anyone else could kind of get involved in that way. And it was such a kind of shrewd tactician kind of brain that was able to think of ways to, try and encourage better deals for other people by playing that game that Ecclestone and Mosley had made it.
Sorry. Completely different cut of character from Giancarlo Minardi, honestly. It's kind of a shame that he could stay in Formula One only that long. If he had gotten another break, maybe another role as team principal of another team, maybe Midland, then Force India, we could have seen some great things from the guy. Minardi was always more reserved, less outspoken. It's kind of a shame because then Minardi is also a great character. Right now, Minardi is not the owner, the head of the association who manages the Imola track.
He's the president of Imola, it says.
Okay, yes, the president. And so now he's in that role, and Imola is doing a lot of stuff. And people don't understand that the Minardi days are an event, and it's really big. It's not comparable to the Formula One race, but it's more comparable to the 6 hours of Imola kind of event. In the sense, it's really big. There is a lot. You actually meet with Martini. You actually meet with Giancarlo Minardi. You can see those cars. You can hear so many stories about the team. And actually, nobody even knows there is this massive event about Minardi. So maybe if there was Paul Stoddart managing this event, maybe there would be a lot more news and people around it.
Yeah, I mean there are still a few links to modern Formula One in that, well, Alonso is still here. Again, RB, that goes without saying. Also, Andrea Kimi Antonelli, actually, because he's represented by Minardi Management, which is run by Giancarlo's son. So that's there as well. So there's all these little areas of influence, as well as being president of Imola Circuit. Giancarlo Minardi, he's also the head of the FIA's Single Seater Commission. So he's still involved in there. So there's all these little pockets where they're still having influence. But I suppose for everyone else, otherwise, it's left to getting to see the cars out on track at these Imola track days. But But yeah, I suppose Minardi. Well, I mean, they're not my favorite backmarker team because my favorite backmarker team is HRT. But I suppose they're, for a lot of people, they are the kind of archetypal backmarkers, and one of the big icons, particularly the V10 era. I think, just again because those are the cars I love. Just very very pretty cars and nice to see them driven in anger.
Well, then actually, since you mentioned HRT, now I'm gonna make a question to the both of you, because Chicane at the beginning mentioned that at the end of 2000, maybe Telefonica could have took over and turned it into a Spanish team. And so my question is, if that had actually happened, do you think the fate of Minardi would have been the same as that of HRT? Do you think it actually would have survived with similar results as current Minardi? Because as I see it right now, I don't think it could have survived, because moving everything to Spain, of course, you can't bring everyone, so you're gonna have to hire new personnel. They aren't gonna have the same expertise nor the same technology developed by Minardi. And then you question if they're gonna have also as good as infrastructures as Minardi has. And on the other hand, though, to counteract this point and support the theory that maybe it could have survived long enough, is that A, Telefonica could have funded the team and give it enough money to survive, and B, Minardi was still the 10th team on the grid, although it would have been Minardi, it would have been called Telefonica. So Telefonica would have been the 10th team on the grid, and Eccleston for Minardi did everything possible to not let them drop out of the grid. So reasonably, you'd think that if Telefonica took over, it would have survived simply because Eccleston would have done everything possible to not make Telefonica leave. So actually, what do you two think? Would it have done better than HRT? Would it have done better than Minardi? Would it have done the same?
Well, it would have done better than HRT. I mean, it depends how much money Telefonica could pump into it, because Alonso would not have stuck around, but they probably could have persuaded Marc Genet to stay on. Maybe even Pedro de la Rosa, because he was at Arrows at the time. Maybe they could have said, "Oh, we're making this all Spanish team. You and Genet come join this." There's potential, I suppose, but it's very hard to say. Better than HRT, but I don't know if it would have lasted any longer than Minardi itself did.
Yeah, it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. I mean, it's not a high bar line to be better than HRT, unfortunately, with a car that was described as behaving more like a rally car than an F1 car. Well, yes, obviously there would have been that huge boost in terms of funding. And are you losing a lot of the infrastructure? Are you losing a lot of the expertise? It's a complete guesswork as to sort of who comes on board with that project and who's supporting that. Spanish motorsport was still very much mostly kind of geared around motorcycling at the time. They were sort of just about shooting more into Formula One because you had Genet there, and even in 2000 was still just a little bit away from sort of the Alonso kind of era beginning as well, and that kind of excitement that would kind of boom in Spain because of that. So yeah, I mean it's complete guesswork to kind of say. Unfortunately, I think maybe it would have been funded for a little bit, but there's every chance it could have ended up more kind of like a Jordan story than anything else, in terms of shunted around from owner to owner year after year, maybe not really kind of settling and finding a home. Whereas at least with the Red Bull partnership, it's at least settled, and there's at least some kind of idea around what it wants to be and how it can kind of continue racing.
Yeah, I think it would have just all it would have meant was, I think it's hard to say it would have been, but maybe Red Bull would have been interested in purchasing this team if they were in a similar strait. I think the only difference it would have made is that the Minardi name just doesn't last as long as it did. You've been listening to the DRS Train podcast. We're on YouTube and Spotify. You can find us on Instagram and X at the DRS Train podcast. Make sure to tune in for our next episode. Stay safe, and we'll see you all next time.
I guess this is it then. I don't think we have anything else to talk about.
Yeah, I think we
about
kind of
Minardi in this period.
Yeah, I think we could have covered everything. Just there's not much else to say on them. Just a lot of people's favorite backmarkers, and certainly one of my favorites as well.